Welcome, 8th graders, to Fiscal Policy. This is going to be a fun one because it has a lot of historical elements and tying the theory and challenges that we've talked about into real-life situations, including last week's fiscal policy plan that Congress passed. So, all italicized words will be copied into your notebook. And to start here, we have a picture of John Maynard Keynes, who we talked about earlier with our business cycle theories, right? He came up with the Keynesian theory of business cycles, which, as we talked about, replaced the classical theory in the 1930s because of the Great Depression. Okay, so let's talk about some of his ideas and mostly the modern way that his ideas are applied. So, fiscal policy is government efforts to promote full employment, that is, make sure that there isn't cyclical unemployment, and price stability, that is to say, not inflation or deflation, by changing government spending or taxes. Okay, so it's the shorter way to describe it would be changing laws, specifically taxes and government spending, in order to influence aggregate demand to try to counter the business cycle. Okay, so that's another way you might see it described, but you should write it down as it appears here. Okay, so in a recession, we could counter that with an expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, and so some of the options for that are increasing government spending, which affects G, obviously, could decrease taxes, okay, which affects which part of aggregate demand? Consumption, because it affects disposable income, right? Remember, disposable income is income minus taxes. Okay, so these taxes for the fiscal policy are always consumer related taxes. So it could be income taxes or could be sales taxes. But notice these are not business taxes. Okay, so if a story ever tells you taxes are changing, but it doesn't say business taxes, you should assume it's consumer taxes like income taxes or uh, sales taxes. Okay, so that one affects consumption, decreasing taxes. Okay, and then we can increase transfer payments, which also affects disposable income, so consumption. Okay, um, if inflation was a concern, could counter that with a contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, so it would have the effect of contracting aggregate demand, right, making it smaller. Okay, so obviously to expand is to make bigger, and to contract is to make smaller. Okay, so the contractionary fiscal policies that we might use if we're concerned about inflation or if we're concerned about a boom would be to decrease government spending, right? That lowers aggregate demand, gets GDP down and price level down. And we could increase taxes, which affects which part of aggregate demand? Yeah, consumption, right? It decreases uh, disposable income, right? So consumption will go down. Okay, and then decreasing transfer payments would also decrease consumption. Okay, so these are the fiscal policy options. Okay, so you don't need to write these, but these are some examples, historical examples of fiscal policies. So after or in the middle of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration implemented the New Deal, quote unquote, spending programs. It's kind of funny. FDR thought that Keynes was kind of a joke and thought his ideas were silly, but implemented this program that nowadays economists would look back on and say, oh, yeah, well, the New Deal was a Keynesian fiscal policy program, right, of doing a lot of government spending in order to increase aggregate demand to try to get out of the recession. But yeah, so looking back on that, we would definitely now count that as a Keynesian fiscal policy, though at the time, FDR didn't think of it that way. And then after the dot-com bubble in 2001, when there was a boom and crash of tech companies, and then also the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, there was a bit of a recession. It was a pretty small recession. But in response, the Bush administration implemented some tax cuts. It was essentially a check mailed to every U.S. household. Um, and that was intended to increase households' disposable income so they would spend more, increasing aggregate demand. And then after the crash of 2009, the housing market crash, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act was passed, and that was a pretty big and complex package. It doesn't look that big now compared to the package that just passed last week. But this law was passed by Congress and had a bunch of different parts. So 35% of the expenditures went for tax cuts to individuals and businesses. Okay? And then 18% went to help states boost their transfer payment programs. So a lot of the transfer payment programs like food stamps and Medicaid are administered on the state level. And so what the federal government did is passed a plan that gave extra money to states for them to do more transfer payments. Okay, so that would boost consumption. Okay, and then about 14% went to other safety net expenditures that are also transfer payments. Okay, like unemployment benefits. And then the last third went to public investment, like infrastructure projects. So there were some road projects, some bridge projects, some other construction projects, which would increase investment spending initially. Okay, so all of these have the purpose of increasing aggregate demand to get out of the recession. You'll notice there's nothing from the 1970s on this, because remember we talked about how in the 1970s, the recession that occurred from OPEC refusing to sell oil to the United States shifted aggregate supply in and caused high inflation and a recession. And so it wouldn't have been a good idea to use a Keynesian fiscal policy at that time because it would have caused more inflation. Okay? Because it would boost aggregate demand, but boosting aggregate demand if you're concerned about inflation seems like a bad idea. So remember we talked about in the 1970s, the Keynesian fiscal policy became less popular. But then now it's a moderately popular idea and something that politicians think about when there's a particular issue with the business cycle. Okay, so expansionary fiscal policy. In order to combat a recession, the government would do an expansionary fiscal policy in order to try to increase real GDP and decrease unemployment. Okay, so remember, real GDP and unemployment are inversely related. As the companies are producing more, they need more workers, right? And that's one of the problems with a recession is lots of people are out of work because the companies aren't producing as much as normal. Right, so you'll notice on this graph, it's an economy in a recession, right? And we've drawn that a bunch before. Oops. And so we see Y1 is less than YF, right? Okay. Good, so that's a recession, right? But then increasing government spending or decreasing taxes shifts aggregate demand out, or that's the intended purpose. Decreasing the unemployment rate, increasing the inflation rate. Normally they wouldn't want to increase the inflation rate, that's just a consequence of increasing aggregate demand. You'll notice that on this graph, the aggregate demand 2 ends up over here so that your Y2 lines up with YF. You definitely don't need to draw it that way because remember, does Congress know exactly how big this gap is and exactly how much spending is needed to fix that gap? No, as we'll talk about, they really have no idea. So as long as you shift aggregate demand out, whether it's too small, too big and causes high inflation and a boom, right, it doesn't matter as long as you're shifting in the right direction. Okay, cool. So that is the expansionary fiscal policy. Okay. The contractionary fiscal policy would be used if there are concerns about high inflation or to slow a boom. We'll talk about this. As far as I know, a Congress in the United States has never done a contractionary fiscal policy, never an intentional one. And we'll talk about that, but Congress is always eager to do the expansionary fiscal policies, but never does a contractionary fiscal policy. And we'll get more into that. But if they wanted to, this is how they would do it, right? They would cut government spending or raise taxes, and that would decrease aggregate demand. So then price level would go down, which would decrease inflation if there were concerns about that, and GDP would go down, which would be good if it was a boom, right? Good to slow the roll so that the crash isn't as bad, or maybe try to smooth it out so that the crash isn't noticeable. And then the unemployment rate would go up, but notice, if we're starting out with an inflationary gap, right, where we notice YF is less than Y1, right, so the production of this economy is more than is normal and sustainable, right, then the unemployment rate is lower than it should be, right? It's lower than the natural rate. And so getting the unemployment rate down to the natural rate is not bad, right? And slowing the roll in a boom is not a bad thing to consider doing, okay? Especially if at this time they're having high inflation. Okay. Great. Then we have a couple sets of key terms that we're going to want to be familiar with. So discretionary versus automatic fiscal policies. So far, I've just been talking about discretionary fiscal policies. So discretion means to have good judgment. Okay, so that's what discretion means. And so discretionary fiscal policy is when Congress uses its discretion, its good judgment, to pass a particular new change in spending or taxes or transfer payments in response to a particular situation, in response to a particular problem. So you'll want to look for in stories, it'll be things like, due to concerns about a recession, Congress cuts taxes, right? Or due to concerns about inflation, Congress decreases government spending, right? Or something like that. But it's the legislative branch of your country, which in the United States we call Congress, passing a particular law that changes taxing or spending in response to a particular problem. Okay. Another kind of fiscal policy that is so cool is the automatic fiscal policy, or automatic counter-cyclical stabilizer if you want, but automatic fiscal policy is what you might see. And these are so cool because Congress doesn't have to do anything new. Congress doesn't have to pass any laws. These are laws that are already in place, passed by previous Congresses, that are always working against the business cycle. Okay, so it doesn't matter if the Congress people today are completely gridlocked and they can't agree on what they want to do. These old laws are already constantly working against the business cycle. So some examples of these are unemployment benefits. So if a person loses their job, they qualify for unemployment, or if they lose their job because of the economy, not because they did a bad job, then they can qualify for unemployment benefits. And that is going to automatically increase during a recession, right? So during a recession, a lot more people are unemployed, and so a lot more people qualify for unemployment benefits. And so Congress didn't have to change the laws at all. It's just automatically a lot more people are qualifying for these benefits, and so government transfer payment spending automatically goes up, okay, without Congress having to pass any new laws. And same if the economy is booming, fewer people are unemployed, and so fewer people qualify for unemployment, and so spending on transfer payments automatically goes down, which is contractionary, which is what we would want to happen during a boom. Okay, and then another example is our progressive tax system. So the way our income tax system works is the more money you make, the higher percent of taxes you have to pay on each extra dollar you earn. So if you don't make a lot of money, then earning an extra dollar, you don't have to pay a lot of taxes on that, right? So the lowest tax bracket, I think, is like 10%, right? So if your family doesn't make much money, the last dollar you earn is taxed at only 10%, right? But if your family makes a lot of money, then each extra dollar you earn is taxed at a higher percentage, right? So if your family makes a lot of money, then the last dollar you earn is taxed maybe at 50%, right? So yeah, we describe these as tax brackets. But what this means is during a boom time, incomes are rising, businesses are doing really well, people are getting raises, families' incomes are going to be higher than normal, right? And so more families are going to be paying higher percentages of taxes because of the way the tax system is built, right? Congress doesn't have to pass any new laws. It's just that as incomes are rising, people are going to have to pay a greater percent of their income in taxes. So taxes automatically go up during a boom. Okay, so it's super cool, right? And so that has the effect of slowing down aggregate demand, which is what we would want. Okay, and same during a recession. Incomes are falling, people are taking pay cuts or taking jobs that are available, but maybe don't pay as well as the job they had before they got fired. And so now the last dollar they earn gets taxed less than it did when they were making more money. So the tax percent of taxes automatically goes down. So that's so cool. We're going to talk about some problems with the discretionary fiscal policy. Like it takes a while for Congress to notice a problem and decide on a course of action. But the automatic counter-cyclical stabilizers are always automatically working. So they're so great. They're so great. The reason why Congress does discretionary policy, even though the automatics are so great, is that the automatic stabilizers are kind of small, right? So if you want to make a big difference in aggregate demand, you'd have to do a discretionary fiscal policy. Okay, so fiscal policies have an effect on the government budget. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the government budget. So just like any other entity that does things, it takes in money and then it uses that money to do the things that it's doing, right? So the government takes in tax revenue, right? So the government taxes people and companies, and that's how it gets money to do things. So that's tax revenue, okay? And that's counted as positive money to the government budget. And then the government spends money on things, so that's subtracted, okay? So the government budget is tax revenues added positive, spending is subtracted, okay? So if the government tax revenue equals the government spending, then that's called balancing the budget. Okay, so write that down. Balanced budget. Okay, balanced budget is when tax revenue minus spending equals 0. Okay, so balanced budget is when tax revenue minus spending equals 0. Okay. Cool. And so this would be sort of the ideal, right? If the government spent about the same amount of money as it brings in tax revenue every year, that would be good, right? Because we wouldn't want the government spending a lot more money than it has in tax revenue every year. That would be irresponsible, right? Just like it'd be irresponsible for a family to spend more money than they earn every year. But we also wouldn't want the government to be sitting on big piles of money when we want the government to spend money on things, or if it's piling up lots of money to cut the taxes, right? So we would really like if the government would just balance the budget every year, right? Okay, so the contractionary fiscal policy, right? We talked about how the government would do that if they're concerned about inflation or a boom, so they could raise tax revenue or lower spending. And that leads to a budget surplus, right? Because that means that they're going to have money left over at the end of the year, right? The tax revenue is going to be greater than the spending, okay? So that leads to a budget surplus when the tax revenue is greater than the government spending. Okay? Great, and if that happens one year, that's fine, right? Again, we wouldn't want the government to do that all the time. But as it turns out, governments almost never have a budget surplus for reasons we'll talk about in a second. But expansionary fiscal policy, right, which Congress would do if they're concerned about a recession, they would lower taxes or raise spending, right? And so either of those actions are going to mean that the tax revenue is smaller than the spending, and that's called a budget deficit. Okay, when the government doesn't have enough tax revenue to do the spending that it's planning to do, and so we get a deficit. Okay, so let's think about this. If a government's running a deficit, where does that money come from? How do they spend more money than they have in tax revenue? They do the same thing that your family would have to do if your family wanted to spend more money than your family earns. Yeah, borrow, exactly. So the government will borrow for that deficit, and that's going to be really important later on. Okay, good. So the government borrows for deficits. Write that down. Government borrows for deficits. Okay, so Keynes was like, all right, well, the government's going to do, or Congress is going to do expansionary policy during the hard times and contractionary policy during the good times. So there's going to be about the same amount of surplus from the good years as there is deficit from the bad years. So they're going to balance out. And so we're going to end up having a balanced budget over the long term, and everything's going to be fine, he thought, right? Okay, cool. So let's see how that played out. Okay, so this graph only goes back to the 1970s, but we can go back to the 1930s and see the exact same trend. So the red years are years that the government budget had a deficit, and the blue years are the years of government budget surpluses. Okay, so you notice a trend, right? That pretty much every year the government runs a deficit. Okay, and the deficits have gotten a lot bigger in the last couple of years, right? In the last decade and a half. The deficits have been shockingly larger. We noticed that they were fairly consistent over the 80s, 90s, but then by the 2010s, 2000s really, and then by the 2010s, they just get really out of control, and we'll talk about some reasons why that is when we talk about national debt. Okay, right. So basically, Keynes was wrong that there would be about the same amount of expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, and that's because the expansionary fiscal policy, where the government spends more than it brings in tax revenue, is extremely appealing for congressmen and women. Okay, because it allows them to spend money and not raise taxes. Okay, and their voters love when Congress spends money on things and hates when Congress raises taxes. Okay? So we're going to talk about that a lot because that's going to be a big deal. And like I said, Congress has never done a contractionary fiscal policy that I know of, for a couple of reasons. Partially because their voters do not want to hear that it's a boom and it's not real growth. Okay, so as we talked about, as you're getting up to the peak of the business cycle, things feel really good. Businesses are expanding, people are getting raises, everything feels great. People are like, oh my gosh, the economy's growing so fast, this is amazing. My house prices are high, stock prices are high, the company I work for is doing great, everything's awesome, right? And they don't want you to tell them, nah, this is probably just a boom, it's probably going to crash, don't get used to this, right? They want to believe that it's real, right? Graph includes a projection into the future. You notice it has 2020, which is obviously this year, um, and then the projections out to 2020. Those projections are going to be really different now with the new fiscal policy plan that was passed last week. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that before we get on to the problems with fiscal policy. Um, the plan that was passed last week is a 2.2 or sorry a $2 trillion spending plan, uh, which is an insane amount of money. It's compared to the spending plan after the crash of 2009, which was thought to be a huge fiscal policy at the time. This one is so much bigger. Um, it's a little bit of transfer payments. There's a tax cut for every family, mail every household a check kind of thing, like happened after the dot-com bubble. Um, and then also lots of increases in unemployment benefits and some other transfer payments, and then also a bunch of emergency loans for different companies, which is, I don't know. Okay, so these situations of the fiscal policy plan being passed always end up being pretty crony, right? It always ends up being the case that a lot of money goes to projects and companies that are friendly with politicians. Okay, so there's that, right? So uh, economists sort of joke about the ideal fiscal policy would be where you just have a helicopter and you just throw bags of cash out of the helicopter, because then the money would be, fairly evenly distributed, and then people would have cash and then they could spend it and that would increase aggregate demand. Um, but of course, in real life, you have to actually spend that money on things, and spending that money on things is like you have to decide what things get the money, and that decision will be made usually for crony reasons, and not on like what would be best for boosting aggregate demand or easing, the well-being of people. So usually a lot of money ends up going to kind of shoddy things. Okay, problems with fiscal policy. We're going to have three of them. First one is that the political motivation leads to mountains of debt. Okay, so Keynes was like, oh, well, there's going to be just as much contractionary fiscal policy as there is expansionary fiscal policy. So we're going to have the same amount of surpluses and deficits. And so the budget's going to be balanced in the long run. And that's totally fine. Don't even worry about it, guys. But it turns out he was really wrong about that, right? He didn't account for the fact that the incentive of politicians is to always spend more money, always tax less, and never cut spending and never raise taxes. Okay. So basically, Keynes made it okay uh, for governments to run a deficit, um, and figured that they would just run surpluses sometimes and everything would be fine, right? But the government now just runs a deficit every single year, and it has for decades. Okay. We're going to talk about national debt next week. There's really no, I mean, like, this is going to be a big problem, right? You can't run deficits forever. A family can't spend more than it earns forever. And so we're going to talk about some problems with that. But I mean, really, the problem is with us, right? With the voters. Voters need to grow up and realize that the government can't be involved in tons of different things and support everything if we don't pay a lot of taxes, right? But we'll talk more about that. Okay, problem two, lags. So it takes time, between months to a year, to recognize the problem. Okay. It also takes time for Congress to decide on an action. So the time to recognize a problem, remember, how long does it take to recognize that we have a recession on our hands? 6 months, right? 2 quarters. So remember, our definition of a recession was 2 quarters or 6 months of declining real GDP. Okay. And so, right, we don't want to jump on, doing a giant fiscal policy for something that's just a little blip, right? So we want to make sure and wait some time to see if it's really a trend, or if, just the GDP happened to be low for a month for some reason, right? But we want to wait and see a trend. But that means that Congress's ability to respond is going to be 6 months behind, right? Now, in the case of the spending plan that was just passed, Congress jumped very quickly on that, because there was a big reason for the recession, right? Or for the suspicion that there would be a recession. So under normal circumstances, the economy crashing doesn't necessarily have one problem, and it's kind of difficult to have any idea how much of an impact that problem will have. Um, right, like the crashing of the housing market in 2008 and 2009, people didn't really know how big of an impact that would have. And so you see this graph here, in the middle of the slide, of real GDP. And so it was increasing during 2007, and then at the beginning of 2008, it goes down a little bit, right? But notice it would have been a bad idea to do a fiscal policy during that time, because we notice it goes right back up, right? And then we're like, oh, well, that was a weird blip that just lasted like 2 months. Okay, then things are back to normal. And then it takes a nosedive, right? And so we see, okay, well, now we have like 4 months of steadily declining real GDP. Okay, we should probably do something about that, right? But right, for all the times that GDP goes down a little bit, right, we don't want to jump on all of those. So we do need to wait for that to happen. But in the present coronavirus situation, there's a pretty clear problem, and the response of lots of governments is to shut down businesses, right? And so basically everyone knows that this is going to be a big deal, right? Once businesses have to start shutting down and nobody's allowed to leave their houses and schools are closing and just everything locking down, people realize, okay, this is going to be a big deal, right? And so Congress started the process of passing this fiscal policy, much sooner than they normally can. Okay, so the lags were much shorter, in this case than it usually is for a fiscal policy. Yeah, because usually it takes, um, you know, at least 6 months to be really sure about a problem. Okay, so then Congress has to decide on an action, and that usually takes a long time because there are a lot of people in Congress and they all have to just agree on what to do. And so that lag time just really is typically very messy. And like I said, lots of random stuff, wasteful stuff, crony stuff gets stuffed into these fiscal policy bills. Um, and so it just takes a long time for Congress people to do that, basically. It's pretty terrible. Okay, and then time to implement the spending, right? So Congress doesn't just pay airplanes to throw cash out of the airplanes, right? They have to actually spend the money on stuff. And so that's kind of a concern, right? Because remember, our classicals thought the economy would come back to normal once the wages adjust, but that might be, 6 months, a year or two, right? And so if these lags add up to 6 months to several years, maybe, then the economy very well might have recovered on its own. Okay, so the fiscal policy might not be any faster than just letting the economy recover on its own. Okay, right. So the crash of 2008 began the second quarter of 2008, so like March, and then it took until the end of the year to declare it a recession, right? Because people didn't know if things were going to turn around. And then Congress passed a fiscal policy in February of that year, and then at the end of that year, only a quarter of the money had been spent, right? So that's 10 months after the fiscal policy was passed, right? And then by the end of the next year, so almost 2 years after the plan was passed, 74% of the money had been spent. And then by the end of the next year, 91% of it spent. Right? So it took a long time to get that money going. So that's a big problem with the fiscal policies usually. The last weakness of fiscal policy is called crowding out. Okay, so the way this one rolls is that in order for the government to do an expansionary fiscal policy, they have to run a deficit, right? The government has to spend more money than it brings in tax revenue. And remember, how does the government get more money to spend that it doesn't have from taxes? Yeah, it borrows the money, right? Just like anyone does if they want to spend more money than they have. Okay, so if the government borrows money to spend more, to increase government spending or to cut taxes, that increases the demand for loans, okay? Because they have to borrow money from people who are saving, just like the businesses borrow money from people who are saving, and consumers who want loans borrow money from people who are saving, okay? So that drives up the interest rate, okay? Because the demand for loans is higher. And so as the interest rate rises, firms and consumers see that higher interest rate and they say, ooh, wow, I was thinking of building a new factory, but yikes, okay, borrowing money is more expensive. No, I won't. Or, wow, I was thinking of buying a new car or a new house, but oh, wow, with that higher interest rate, it's not worth it, okay? So that discourages some borrowing that consumers and firms would have done anyway, right? Okay, so the government borrowing to do the spending, the fiscal policy, crowds out borrowing and spending that consumers and firms would have done. Okay, so if there is crowding out, fiscal policy is less effective. Okay, that is to say, the government borrowing just replaces some of the borrowing that would have happened anyway. Okay, so Congress will be like, oh yay, we're so great, we're doing all this spending to increase aggregate demand. Without us, aggregate demand would have been so low, right? But if there's crowding out, then they're just replacing some of the borrowing and spending that consumers and firms would have done. Okay, so yeah, so the government borrowing means that other people can't borrow that money. So that's crowding out. All right, great. Okay. So, good job, guys. In short, fiscal policy is the process by which the government tries to return an economy back to full employment equilibrium. Okay. So use expansionary policy to get out of a recession by increasing government spending or decreasing taxes, while contractionary policy aims to lower inflation by decreasing government spending and or raising taxes. Okay. So we're going to do more with this model. And next week, planning to talk about the national debt, which is obviously very closely related and important. But anytime Congress takes action to fix the economy, it's a discretionary fiscal policy, right? And anytime laws that are already in place have the effect of automatically raising taxes or cutting government spending or changing transfer payments, those are automatic policies. Okay, cool, great job, guys. You're awesome.